Welcome everyone to the fifth and final webinar in the Special Agents of Change series with Dr. Barry Prezant. I'm Clay Whitehead, the co-CEO and co-founder of Presence. We provide live online speech therapy, occupational therapy, behavioral interventions, and mental health services, as well as assessment services to school districts in 43 states. This highly informative series started back in February with Trip Hawkins and Janice Tobin's perspective and advice on social and emotional learning, followed in March by Shari Robertson on early reading strategies. In April, we heard from Dr. Marty Burns about working with older students with autism and attention disorders. Dr. Frances Stetson joined us in May on the imperative for change in special education. All of these webinars are available for replay on the Presence Learning website. The final webinar in our spring series is a real bonus and could not be more timely and relevant to our work together here in this webinar series. Helping children with autism succeed and providing them with the services and support that are so important to their success is a growing challenge for special educators in our nation. But all too often, we've measured progress on the basis of ridding individuals of autistic symptoms and behaviors. Now, there's a movement to change these perceptions and practices based on understanding the uniqueness of students with ASD and the many practical ways we can help students with autism achieve both in school and in life outside of school. And so, we're honored to have the leading proponent and expert, Dr. Barry Prezant, with us for the next hour. Barry's been a sped ahead presenter twice before, and he is one of our most requested experts. Barry's background and credentials, as you can see on the screen, are impressive. He's been a researcher, clinician, consultant, and he has received ASHA's highest recognition. And soon to be added to this list is his authorship of what is expected to be a landmark book on autism, soon to be released by Simon & Schuster, called Uniquely Human. Barry, welcome back.
Thank you, Clay, for that kind introduction. It's my pleasure to be back to do another webinar as part of this great series for Presence Learning. Today, I wish to share my thoughts on our work that's consistent with a different and what some have called a refreshing perspective, resulting in new attitudes and approaches for working with students with autism and their families. In this webinar, it's my goal that you will be able to first replace long-standing stereotypes and misunderstandings of the behavior of students with autism with a more accurate, evidence-based, and productive perspective. Secondly, that you'll be better able to understand the experience of parents and respond to their concerns in order to build collaborative and trusting relationships. Third, you'll be able to critically address commonly accepted beliefs about the challenges that educators face in serving children with autism and to better understand why many commonly used practices do not necessarily result in the best long-term outcomes. And finally, it is my hope that you'll be able to apply the uniquely human perspective in modifying and improving educational practices and to help school communities to be more responsive to the needs of children with autism and their families. So why the term or the concept of uniquely human? Well, we know for sure that the behavior we sometimes observe in individuals with autism is distinct from what we tend to see in many other students, but much of these behavioral patterns are misunderstood and in some cases dehumanized, and I'll be giving you some examples of the language that often goes along with that. Even when we talk about deep interests and strengths, which we often see in students with autism, they may be referred to as obsessive, and in many cases there are attempts to reduce or eliminate these patterns of behavior. So too often, the behavior of students with autism is judged as inappropriate without asking why. In a similar way, the family experience of having a family member with autism, in this case a student with autism, is often described as a tragedy in very negative terms. And a behavioral perspective, what many of you are familiar with as ABA, but we just look at the surface behavior either of students with autism or how parents may react to our attempts to support students, and we don't look at a more longitudinal, developmental, person and family-centered perspective to better understand the patterns of behavior in a student with autism as well as the reactions of the parents. And we believe that it's essential to do this to provide a more accurate picture of both the student and the family experience, for the students to experience success in schools and for families to develop more positive relationships with staff and administrators in schools. We're going to focus on 4 issues. First, understanding the behavior of students with autism. What are some of the challenges and what might their experience be? Secondly, understanding the experience of parents. What are some of their challenges and their experiences? We're also going to work on debunking the belief that autism is simply a tragedy for the child and a tragedy for the family. And then finally, we're going to work on debunking the belief that autism is only something that is within the child. So from a uniquely human perspective, we believe that autism is best understood as a shared human experience. Now, certainly, this shared human experience results in challenges and difficulties, and we'll be addressing some of those, but also the potential for growth for all students and even growth and evolution of the school community as a compassionate and caring community. So let's begin with some of the common descriptions of behavioral patterns in autism. And you could certainly read these in the literature. I think there's definitely been some improvement over the years in that we've become more respectful in our language. But as a consultant who gets out into schools on a very regular basis, these are terms I still hear that certainly convey certain attitudes and beliefs that from a uniquely human perspective we feel need to be modified or changed. So terms such as non-compliant, when a student does not go along with what we request. Again, the emphasis here is that it is something that's within the child, and certain approaches actually work on decreasing non-compliance without asking the why question, which we'll be getting back to in just a few minutes. Or a student might be considered stubborn if he wants to do things in a certain way, or gets very upset and might resist changes in routine or changes in, for example, the way a lesson is presented to the class. Some students are described as manipulative in that they are engaging in particular patterns of behavior just to push the buttons or to test reactions. Another term that's used quite often is perseverative, which has to do with getting stuck in patterns of repeating things the same way. And very often, even for your brightest, most verbal students, they might be referred to as being rude, even though we know intellectually that students with autism have a difficult time learning social rules and learning how to grade what they say so it's more appropriate for different situations. Sometimes patterns of behavior, and very often motor patterns of behavior, are referred to as bizarre. Or if a student tends to move away from people or avoid people as avoidant. Controlling is a very big issue because we know that students with autism do benefit from things being very predictable and very much the same, and may engage in behaviors to keep things very predictable and very much the same. So a student may always want to sit in a particular seat or stand in line either at the front or the back of the line, or even correct a teacher for not doing the lesson the way that teacher has traditionally done that lesson. Certainly, we hear the word challenging quite a bit, and that's a very commonly used term in education, challenging behavior. Obsessive, being very highly focused on particular topics, particular interests. Self-stimulatory, having to do with repetitive motor behaviors that seem to be an attempt to increase stimulation. And very often, regardless of what the behavior looks like, the term non-functional is often used. The notion of aggressive comes up quite often, and we'll be talking about that a little bit more specifically. And then even speech and language characteristics may be referred to as meaningless or just parroting behavior, as in speech repetition known as echolalia, immediate echolalia, repeating things immediately, or delayed echolalia. Sometimes students with autism will say things that we cannot perceive as connected to an activity or as connected to a situation, and those comments may be thought of as irrelevant. Perseverative speech can also be a descriptor of a pattern that we see when kids say things over and over again. And very often, if we cannot decipher what the student is meaning to say or how it connects to a situation, we may call it non-communicative or even silly talk. That's a term that I hear quite a bit in my consulting. So there are particular consequences when we misunderstand the behavior of students with autism. And that's what I'd like to dig in on now. Let's really think about, with this misunderstanding, how does that impact the way we react and we behave and the way we talk about students? First of all, there's little need to ask why. So if a student engages in patterns of behavior that are difficult for us to understand, we may just label it as non-compliant. Oh, he's engaging in silly talk again. And when we put those labels, it immediately gives us permission not to ask why. And if we don't ask why, it gives us permission not to look for additional supports that we could put into place. And another point that I would really like to emphasize in the webinar today is it doesn't give us the opportunity to empathize and to try to understand the experience of the student that may lead to these patterns of behavior. So we tend to just categorize behavioral patterns as desirable or undesirable, and ultimately the decision is it's the student who needs to change. So that's our job, to change the behavior of the student, even though we know that there are neurological differences, that, quote unquote, the brain is wired differently in autism, which may result in a different way of seeing the world and a different way of understanding social experiences. So even though very often intellectually we have that understanding that the brain in autism functions differently and sections of the brain connect differently than our brains do, and of course this is supported by functional imaging research, and more it's become a descriptor in the field of autism that people with autism have different brains, not damaged brains. Even though we know that, we still make these judgments, and we try not, unfortunately, to dig in deeper and to really support and empathize appropriately. What I'm referring to is reflective practice. And reflective practice, in the eyes of many, is now considered to be the gold standard of practice in many therapy fields as well as in education. And what reflective practice refers to is that we have to examine our own practices. We have to reflect back on what we are doing, and are we being most effective, and do we need to change in the way we behave, both with students and parents. And another consequence is that if we don't model our efforts to understand a student's behavior and to explain to other students or have discussions with other students about why a child or a student behaves in a certain way, that leads to a much higher likelihood of bullying. Because bullying occurs in many cases when a student sees another student who seems vulnerable, who behaves differently, but there's no understanding of why that happens. And one of the preventative factors against bullying is increased communication and understanding. Of course, there are many factors associated with bullying behavior, but one of them is when a student does not understand why another student either looks differently, talks differently, or reacts differently. So, what have we learned from experience and research? One very important point in a uniquely human perspective is that there is no such thing as autistic behavior. We are talking about human behavior. And this is a quote that I first learned from a woman with autism who's an international lecturer. Her name is Roz Blackburn. And Roz very clearly demonstrates that, yes, sometimes when she gets excited, she gets up and she stands on her toes and flaps her hands. But she also says, well, you know, you see that on TV shows where somebody's just won a game show or won the lottery. And now we're talking about people who are so-called neurotypical people jumping up and down and flapping their arms and hands. So what Roz explains to us is that her threshold for being excited is much lower than our threshold, and therefore she engages in behaviors of great excitation, in some cases of great anxiety, and is not able to inhibit those patterns as easily as we are. So in many cases, the behavioral patterns that we see in autism, whether it's a student dropping to the ground, whether it's a student engaging in echolalia by repeating speech, or whether it's a student who's becoming what seems to be argumentative and refusing to engage in a particular activity, that in most cases, these patterns of behavior are reactions to confusion, stress, and anxiety. And in some cases are attempts to communicate and cope. They may be unconventional attempts to communicate and cope. So for example, if a child drops to the floor before going into a gym, it may look like inappropriate, undesirable behavior, but it may be a survival tactic or a survival skill from the eyes and the perspective of that student. I can't go into that gym, it's overwhelming. I will not be able to handle it. And if we perceive any situation that we perceive as overwhelming and that we can't handle it, we too would try to escape or leave, but we have many, many more strategies to do that. So the bottom line is that we need to ask why. So I'm showing you a worksheet now of a student, and this particular student was in a third grade class where she and her classmates were doing lessons during Martin Luther King's birthday week. And one of the lessons had to do with filling out this worksheet about how each student sees him or herself as similar or different from Martin Luther King. And when I was consulting to this student, the teacher was very concerned that a lot of the comments that she filled in on the worksheet that I'm showing you were irrelevant and did not at all address the topic of how Martin Luther King made contributions to society and how we should respect a person like Martin Luther King for all that he's done for our nation. So you could see that Shelby wrote, well, Martin Luther King, he likes dogs, he could read books. And then she wrote, he has a tie, I don't have a tie. And then she wrote, he helps me, he cleans my room. Now, of course, what this student is being asked to do is to make very, very abstract judgments about how Martin Luther King contributed to society over the years. And when she was asked, as all the students were, compare yourself to Martin Luther King, she began to talk about things from her perspective, that she liked dogs and that she could read books. So, well, Martin Luther King is similar because he likes dogs and he could read books. In other words, a very, very concrete and literal response. If you look at the picture on the worksheet, there's a picture of Dr. King wearing a tie. So she looks at this figure wearing a tie, and she realizes she doesn't have a tie. So how does she compare herself to Dr. King? He has a tie, I don't have a tie. And then when they're talking about positive traits, and that's actually the word that was used, can you describe Dr. King's positive traits and compare that to your positive traits? She just throws out some answers which kind of fit very loosely. Your positive trait is, well, he helps people, so he helps me and he cleans my room. So in other words, we could look at these as irrelevant responses, but we could also understand that this student has this neurologically based disability of autism, and she has problems understanding very, very complex social concepts, such as contributions to society and positive traits that a person has. So we could turn this on its head and say, well, wait a second, she really isn't just making all these irrelevant comments. She's really trying hard to get this right. And due to her disability, these misunderstandings that she has about these concepts leads to what looks like irrelevant comments. I'm also going to show you now another slide of a student who just listed all of these numbers in sequence and using different colored markers to do that. And this was shown to me as an example of this student engaging in perseverative behavior. Now, the whole context of this situation was this student who was in first grade made this whole list of numbers in sequence with different colored markers during a conference with parents. So we were talking with the parents, and he was given this tin of markers and some white paper, and this is what he made, and it ended up in this beautiful rainbow of colors with these number sequences. So we could look at it as perseverative, and we could look at it as, well, you know, it wasn't exactly like he was playing with imagination, but we could also turn this on its head and we could say, you know, he had to sit there with these adults sitting around him, probably using language that he doesn't understand, and he needed something to cope. He needed to engage in an activity to stay well-regulated emotionally. And it actually was a very effective activity because he was able to sit there for up to 20 minutes to a half hour and stay well-regulated while he was focused on this activity. Once again, if we had just looked at this as perseverative behavior and highly repetitive non-functional behavior, then it doesn't take us any further. We don't say, what is this student's experience and how might we help him, and even understand that having a routine of having markers and papers to write on might help him in situations that are a little bit overstimulating and overwhelming for him. We're now going to talk about a number of steps that we can go through. And this is something that I often encourage school teams to do when they're trying to understand a student and provide the right support. The first step is to build an understanding, and that relates directly to some of the examples I just gave. So we could build our understanding of echolalia, that echolalia is not just meaningless parroting, and in fact our research demonstrated that very often it is functional communication and part of a student's language development if you track it over time, rather than just look at it in a snapshot of time and saying, oh, he's just repeating what people say. Inflexible controlling behavior. Again, in many cases, we will see a student really dig his or her heels in, wanting certain things to happen in a particular way, or being seated in a particular seat, or following a particular routine at a particular time of day. It looks like it's controlling, but research also has demonstrated that we see more quote-unquote controlling behavior when there's more anxiety that a student is experiencing. Aggression is another important point that comes up all the time. As a matter of fact, a recent study in 2013 found that, depending upon how you define aggression, 50 to 80% of students with autism currently have some form of aggressive behavior or historically were considered to be aggressive students. Once again, we need to look past just the word. And in my experience, students often display physically resistant behavior or even behavior that may be harmful to others when they are feeling highly anxious, when they're feeling trapped, if you will, or when people put their hands on them. And so that tactile defensiveness, that sensitivity to touch, results in striking out behavior. Obsessive interests. It's very interesting that many people in the autism culture and community have redefined that term. So many adults with Asperger's now say, don't call my deep interests obsessions. They are deep interests. And you need to respect that because many of you have deep interests as well, and they're not necessarily called obsessive behaviors or obsessions. So the second point after building understanding is respond with compassion. So we could try to literally put ourselves in the shoes of a student with autism and say, well, why does the student need to do this? Would I do that same kind of thing? So that goes along with the building understanding. But responding with compassion is really that empathic response and being able to say, I can understand why he bolts away from that music room when we bring him up to the music room. Because when we ask him to be in that room, very often he's covering his ears because the music is just so loud and difficult for him to process. The next step, which takes us quite a bit further than just understanding and responding with compassion, is expressing appreciation. And that has to do with the fact that if we know and we understand the fact that individuals on the autism spectrum have neurologically based challenges, let's look at their coping strategies And let's look at the cup half full in terms of what is the student actually trying to do to maybe stay within an activity as opposed to leaving the classroom. It might be that he's rocking, it might be he's tapping his pencil, but rather than isolating those as behaviors that are undesirable, again, we could turn the whole concept on its head here if we say, yeah, but he's staying in his seat as well. So let's look at what's going right and appreciate how hard it might be for a student, especially in the school environment, which has so many transitions, in many cases, so much unpredictability. From a social perspective, a lot of social complexity. And those factors we know can be very, very difficult for students with autism to deal with. And then finally, if we try to empathize, we have the understanding, we have the ability to express appreciation, that then opens the door for us to provide the appropriate supports that are needed. And we break down support into interpersonal supports, everything having to do with how do we support a child if they look anxious to help them be better regulated emotionally. Also, how do we simplify language? Do we slow our rate of speaking down? Do we give a student enough processing time to understand what we're saying? Those are just some examples of interpersonal supports. In terms of learning supports, do we provide visual supports for a student? Do we modify the curriculum? Do we present information in such a way that it's a good match for the student's strengths, especially in terms of very clear specified directions for the students? So we need to understand how to have comprehensive interpersonal and learning supports, but to take that step, we have to understand why the student is either succeeding or having difficulty. We have to respond with compassion, and we have to also appreciate what's going right and understand why it's going right, what supports are in place, such that this student is doing well in this activity, in this subject area, and not in others. Many of you know is very, very common for individuals on the spectrum to have the peaks and valleys, to be very competent in some areas. It could be academic areas in the curriculum, but to be very challenged in other areas. So what are some actions that schools can take? And of course, a lot of what I'm going to share with you now is really educating the school community. And I'm not just talking about the other students, educating all of the teachers, educating the administrators. And how can we do that? With disability and autism awareness programs, and of course, virtually all schools have some form of disability awareness programs, but I'm also talking about digging in much more specifically on the characteristics of behavior that we see in autism, or the reactions of students with autism that may be not as easily understood. Yes, I have been in schools where there's been ongoing disability awareness programs at very general levels about the importance to understand and accept students with disabilities, but on very specific levels, such as a student doing really well in some subjects but not even wanting to cooperate in others, or a student who's very echolalic, or a student who has problem behaviors. It seems that sometimes that awareness does not trickle down when there are particular patterns of behavior that might be off-putting or not understood by other staff, and certainly other students in many cases. Programs that bring in or have students with autism who attend the school talking about their autism very often is helpful. So, of course, we're talking about older students. I've seen this in schools with older elementary age students, typically those students who have greater abilities to communicate their thoughts and feelings, but certainly at the middle school and the high school level. Quite a difference when I go into schools and I see there's this wonderful acceptance and really well done inclusion, and then I learn, well, every year students with autism actually have a chance to speak to other students about their autism, or maybe in a school assembly to have a little bit of a panel and speak to the full staff and other students about what the experience of autism is, or the experience of having Asperger's, which of course is no longer a category that is diagnosed according to DSM. Sometimes having parents come into the school setting and talking to students and staff as well. Now, some parents are very comfortable doing that. Some parents are not so comfortable doing that, but still may share information that they would like a teacher to share with the other students or staff in the school. These are just some strategies that could be helpful. Finally, some schools now will bring adults with autism into the school to speak to the staff and the students in the school from more of a lifelong perspective of what it was like for them when they were in school and what's helpful to them and what's not helpful to them. We are seeing so much more happening in the self-advocacy movement, as many previously children and school-age people with autism are now becoming adults and see the need to speak out for other people with autism. So now we're going to shift our perspective a little bit, and we're going to talk about parents of children and students with autism and the fact that they are often misunderstood, and sometimes we'll use the word bum rap. They get a bum rap, okay? So very often, parents are described as engaging in challenging behavior themselves, and sometimes that behavior just has to do with trying to get what they feel will be most helpful for their student or their child. Sometimes parents are described as aggressive, in this case not physically aggressive, but verbally aggressive, especially if they're feeling anxious and that things are not happening in a way that they hoped it would happen for their child or their student in school. Sometimes parents are described as non-compliant. Does this sound familiar? Kind of similar descriptors that we often give to kids. Sometimes parents are described as being unrealistic, that they really set high goals for their child, and they feel that other people don't have those same hopes and dreams and higher level goals for the student in the program. Some parents are described as disengaged and not caring. Some parents are described as overly protective. And I need to say that too often these descriptors are applied to parents who are just trying to do their best. Of course, in a very broad range of population, you're going to have parents of kids with autism who vary greatly in their personality characteristics and their mental health status in many different ways, as we see that in the population of so-called neurotypical kids. We still have to deal with that issue of a misunderstanding of why parents behave or react or say things in a particular way. And there are specific consequences that if we label parents as that's a really aggressive dad, or that's a non-compliant mom, or that's a mom in denial, and so forth, by seeing a parent only through that window, that could negatively impact collaboration, because then we perceive a lot of what that parent says or does just on that basis. It also gives us permission not to listen well. So in some cases, well, let me give you a specific example. Just comes to mind. I had a consult about 2 weeks ago, and I was told that this parent speaks very often in non sequiturs and doesn't stay on topic, and she's very difficult to follow. So what the staff said to me, and this staff was in a school that does a very nice job with kids, the staff said to me, you know, it's really hard to listen, so we don't even listen that much anymore when she comes in. We just let her talk. It ended up that day that that parent was invited in, as I often request when I'm doing consultations, and I found her to be quite an interesting person, that she was of a particular ethnic group from Brooklyn in New York City, and I could relate to that because that's where I'm from, and she did talk quite quickly, and sometimes it would seem like she would go from one topic to the next and go off on tangents, but if you really listen to her, she was so there for her kid, and she was so there to try to help her kid in any way that she could. And what I needed to do and model for the staff a little bit was to help her to be a little bit more organized and stay on the point, but it wasn't difficult to do at all. And as a matter of fact, at the end of the meeting, a number of the staff members said, wow, you know, she really is saying some important things there. We just weren't getting it. So sometimes just by labeling a parent in a particular way, that might interfere with our ability to really get at the message that that parent is trying to communicate about their son or daughter, or about the experience of having a child with autism. What's very much related to that is we develop judgmental attitudes, unfortunately. And we live in a judgmental culture to begin with, and one of the things that we're most judgmental about in our culture is how parents raise kids. And Once again, we know intellectually that these are kids with neurologically based disabilities, but sometimes we still make the same judgments of a parent as if they are raising a neurotypical child. Too often there's a disproportionate focus on problems rather than successes. And I can understand that, especially if a student is very challenging. In a way, it's a way for staff to vent or seek support, but parents tell us over and over again, and this is based upon my anecdotal experiences as well as research, is that we know the challenges, we live with the challenges 24/7. We also want you to bend over backwards to look at the cup half full. What do you like about my child? What does she do well? What is he really motivated to do? Now, one of the big problems when relationships with parents go downhill is litigation. And too often, when there are lawsuits that are brought against the school, again, that immediately leads us to put those parents in a particular category, but not really putting enough attention into how did we get to this point. Again, that notion of reflective practice. What have we learned from experience and research, and what do parents tell us? And it is amazing, if you go online now, many blogs that are run by parents of students with autism, many chat rooms, sometimes organized by the Autism Society of America or Autism Speaks. It's very instructive, I believe, for any professional to go online and read some of that, because you really do get very candid and honest perceptions by parents at a time and place where they feel comfortable in saying what they wish to say, whereas they may not feel comfortable saying that in a meeting in school, for example. Very often parents will say, you know, they're doing the best they can. They're juggling a million balls, not just the child with autism, but a lot of other issues in many cases, and they feel that sometimes educational staff do not understand how much they are juggling. Too often they feel judged, and I'm not saying it's intentional or it's mean-spirited, but professionals can be, or at least communicate a judgmental attitude too often with parents, and they don't realize that they're doing it. If parents don't follow through, it could be not that they're not being compliant or that they're not involved or that they don't wish to be involved in their child's education. It could be that they don't understand how to follow through. So in a recent consult, we were talking about the fact that in one child's home there were 5 kids. 2 of the kids had disabilities. 1 had autism. Another had a significant learning disability. And the staff were talking about, oh, it's probably just a chaotic home. And then the speech-language pathologist said, well, I gave her pictures so that she could communicate a schedule for the kids, which should really be helpful. And I said, okay, you just gave her a book of pictures. And then she said, well, maybe I gave her too many pictures. And then I said to her, did you model for her or ask her to come into school to see how we use pictures to help a child understand the sequence of events, which research has demonstrated improves behavior, improves learning. And this professional said, you know, I didn't really do that. I just handed her a book of Mayor Johnson picture symbols. And in that case, not only is this a parent who may be overwhelmed, but a parent who doesn't have a clue how to set up pictures and use them as a picture schedule to help all of the kids in the home, not just the child with autism. And as I just alluded to, very often parents have many other issues. Illness in the family, they could be sandwich kids, raising their own kids, but also taking care of elderly parents. There's so much going on. And we can ask parents about that directly. We could literally say to them, is this possible for you to do? Is this something you're interested in doing? Do you need me to show you or help you implement what we're suggesting if it is possible and you're interested in doing this? Let's go through those same steps to increase understanding and better serve families. Step number 1 is building that understanding. And one of the great factors that causes difficulty for families and stress is that stress of uncertainty, not knowing what the future holds for that child in the family. And the more we could make the aspect of school and school routines and rituals more certain, to let parents know when meetings will be happening, how we begin the transition planning process, just to let them know that we will let the school experience appear to them to be one that's organized, that one that we will address many of the issues that you're dealing with. We need to try to understand where the family is in their journey. And I don't see enough discussion about this at all. Responding with compassion. How must the parent feel? And acknowledging those feelings rather than moving ahead with business in the school as if this isn't a very emotional issue for the parents, especially if they're trying to learn about autism at the same time that they're trying to support their child, at the same time they're deluged with information in the media and on the internet. So how can we help them? Reactions in public is a huge issue that too often I do not see school teams bringing up for discussion. Many parents report that as the major stressor in their lives. Many parents say, you know, the autism thing, we're learning to deal with it. You know, we're going to do okay. But it's going out into public that is so stressful for us, and we don't know how to deal with explaining our child's disability to others. Expressing appreciation. If we understand the neurologically based challenges of a child with autism and the family trying to cope with some of those challenges, expressing appreciation about how difficult it must be. And when things are going well, and I always make sure to do this, when a student is doing well in school or have adjusted well, making some nice progress, I will always say to the parents, you know, you got to give yourself a pat on the back because kids don't do well unless everybody is working well with this student. And what we see happening here in school also comes from what you're doing at home. And usually parents so appreciate getting those strokes because too often they do not get that. In terms of providing support, letting them be heard, showing respect, helping them to prioritize what's most important. And even if they're not sure by what they say, we could help them to do that. Valuing their intuitions and validating their intuitions about what is best for their child. And then, of course, saying, how can we help you? How can we be of service to you? Because that's what we are. We're service providers. And due to the strong emotions that surround caregiving and teaching students with autism, sometimes we lose track of that notion that we are service providers. What are actions that schools can take to help us develop these relationships and understand that not only do we have a student who's uniquely human, but that we also have families that have uniquely human experiences? Well, first of all, staff training in family-centered practice and in how to communicate with parents, very, very important. Having full-time staff, if possible, with expertise in family systems, whether it's a social worker on the staff or a school psychologist who's trained in family systems and family-centered intervention. Making sure that parent advisory committees are supported so parents feel there is an organized, systematic way to feel heard and therefore feel supported. And for those schools who go the extra mile, parents love it when they see schools and staff in schools go the extra mile. Special supports for families, for example, after-school coverage for a parent's night out, or having special fairs in the school where the parents can be educated about resources in the community beyond the school so they don't have to go and do that all by themselves. Anything that helps parents get to helpful resources that they don't have to do on their own is so appreciated, and that's another example of the school going the extra mile. Personally, I believe that should be a core function of schools, and many schools do that. The next category that I want to address that is a myth that we have to change, and that is that autism spectrum disorders is nothing more than a tragedy for the student and the family, because the media communicates this in so many ways. That's what many parents, especially parents of newly diagnosed kids, that's the information that they're surrounded with. And parents talk all the time about going online to read or listening to another parent, and all they hear is the doom and the gloom. And they don't hear that, you know, that's not always the case, and for many families it's very much not the case. It's an opportunity for growth. Yes, there are challenges, but it's also an opportunity to experience life more deeply. And that's actually a quote from a parent. Autism has allowed us to experience life more deeply. Just to show you the different extremes on this point, I'm showing you now a slide of a man named Blind Tom. And Blind Tom was a man named Thomas Wiggins who lived from 1846 to 1908. And by all descriptions, he clearly had autism, but he was also blind. So he was considered to be an incredible savant when it came to music, to the extent that he could listen to classical pieces and memorize them and play them on the piano after he's listened to them just once or twice. Now, he was recognized for this skill, and he was taken on tour around the country. There was a person who worked with him who appreciated his genius, but he also had very unusual mannerisms. When he wasn't playing piano, he, for example, just before going on stage, he would sit and he would rock and he would spin himself in circles, and he looked like he was in the proverbial little world of his own, which is often used to describe kids with autism. So here are some of the reviews in the newspapers from the late 1800s describing this man with autism and blindness, who in some ways was a genius. One reviewer of his concert said this: "Here is a monstrosity, the soul of some unfortunate defunct musician misbehaving on earth." In other words, total dehumanizing this person, just based upon their behavior. Then Blind Tom was described by another reviewer in this way: "I think of him as marvelously gifted by nature. He is an angel sent by God." Now, very interesting, we also see these extreme patterns in describing autism and the experience of autism, even as recently as last month. So the notion of autism as a tragedy is often communicated in this way. And this is a quote from David Kirby, who published a book, it was about 10 years ago, called Evidence of Harm. And this was a book where he was making the argument that vaccines caused autism. And he described autism in his introduction to his book in this way, quote, "Autism is a lost, hellish world," close quote. Okay, now that was 10 years ago, and again, we've seen some progress. But let me quote Robert Kennedy Jr. from 1 month ago. 1 month ago, he stated, and he was trying to explain why he used the word Holocaust, for which he needed to eventually apologize, to describe the experience of autism. So this is a quote from Robert Kennedy Jr. "I employed the term Holocaust as I struggled to find an expression to convey the catastrophic tragedy of autism, which has now destroyed the lives of over 20 million children and has shattered their families." Let me give you some other examples of how people have referred to autism or the experience of autism. This comes from a mother of a 9-year-old son with autism, and this is from her blog. Quote, "Welcome to our little corner of the world. Some call it autism, others call it despair and sorrow. I happen to call it hope, beauty, and fascination." John Elder Robison, who's a well-known self-advocate and who's written a few books, one very well-known book called Look Me in the Eye, and it's about his life with Asperger's, and he says, quote, "Asperger's is not a disease. It's a way of being. There is no cure, nor is there a need for one. There is, however, a need for knowledge and adaptation on the part of Aspergian kids and their families and friends." And I think that's very well stated, because that's very much the philosophy of Uniquely Human. Let's really understand the differences, and let's have the knowledge to make the adaptations that support people on the spectrum, but also help people on the spectrum with the appropriate supports adapt to the requirements of schools and the requirements of society. And then finally, one dad of an 8-year-old son with autism said, quote, "The people who have been most helpful to us are those who do not take away our hope. We have learned to keep away from the doom and the gloom crowd." And too often, we do, unfortunately, see parents and professionals who just see autism as a tragedy, and their efforts are about change the child, cure the child. Anything short of that is totally wrong. So what are the consequences of an autism is a tragedy perspective? Well, parents might be pitied and sometimes judged for being too protective, judged for not being involved enough. Some professionals may feel they have to rescue the child and family, and that we have all the answers, and that ridding the child of autistic behaviors are the biggest indicators of progress, as opposed to looking at how engaged the child is. Is the child an active learner? Is the child well-regulated emotionally, for example? Some professionals do not know how to talk about autism in a more balanced way. For example, with a sense of humor. Many, many parents have a sense of humor, which is a good coping strategy, about how their child behaves, what they've done in a store or a restaurant or in public, and looking at the cup half full. And once again, if you embrace that autism as tragedy notion, it's very difficult for you to make that leap. Professionals also may believe that the #1 concern for the parents is the child with autism, and as we mentioned, that may not be the case. We can go through our 4 steps once again to refute that autism is a tragedy belief. Understanding, first of all, even though the media may convey this to some extent, but we have to understand that parents crave hearing the positives, and students crave hearing the positives about themselves and their own competence, especially in terms of building self-esteem and having positive associations with school. Compassion, understanding how it may feel to hear mostly challenges about your child if you are a parent of a child with autism. And in many cases, parents feel they're being blamed for their child's behavior, even if they know it's not true, or they feel that hope is being taken away from them. Appreciation. Well, we can appreciate in a different way in interacting with parents by creating positive images of their child, maybe saying things like, he works so hard, I know it's not easy for him. Or when things are very challenging for him, we kind of expect that he might engage in some difficult behavior. Rather than saying it's the child's fault, making ourselves a part of it or making some of the demands of school a part of that. And of course, celebrating successes. When we celebrate successes, that builds trust with the child, it builds trust with the parents. And then finally, and this is really one of the biggest movements in the field of autism right now, is really understanding and stating a student's strengths, but more than just stating and understanding those strengths, making sure we actively use those strengths, whether it has to do with academics, whether it has to do with a child who shows exceptional musical skills. So I'll just give you an example of that right now. Actions that school can take would be celebrating success and showing off the abilities of students with autism. So in a consult last year, I observed a music teacher who was a teacher of many, many kids, but he could pick out the particular skills in music that some kids demonstrated, whether they had perfect pitch, having the student get up and sing a song in front of the class, being able to identify notes, being able to identify whether a melody is correct or incorrect in a song. Many years ago, I consulted with a little boy who loved time, and he would come over to me and look at my watch and say, Dr. Barry, it's 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And he would say that as a way to greet me. Well, this young man is now an adult. And throughout his school years, they very often used his interest in time and his strength in time perception, for example, by being a timekeeper for activities that needed that in school, using a stopwatch, for example. Now he's a young adult, and interestingly, he only enjoys timed sports. He doesn't watch or enjoy baseball all that much because it's not a timed sport. But hockey or football, yep, he's a big New England Patriot fan, and he loves the Boston Bruins because that makes so much more sense, and it also taps into an interest of his. What can we do in the school context? We could talk about famous, accomplished people with autism. How often is that done? Certainly with the important idea of integrating people from all ethnicities and all races, we do highlight the accomplishments of people of different ethnicities and races, but do we do that for people with autism? For example, talk about Albert Einstein. Most people agree was probably on the autism spectrum. Talk about a Temple Grandin and all that she's accomplished. A recent Miss America contestant, Miss Montana, was a woman with Asperger's who spoke very openly about that. So this is something that's spoken about now in the Autism Self-Advocacy Network, but we certainly can do that in school settings as well. Share positive stories from the media. The basketball player who scored all those consecutive three-point scores a couple of years ago, a few months ago, there was a viral video on YouTube about a UPS driver who brought a truck for a young child with autism because he saw that the young boy loved trucks. And so he went out of his way to bring him a truck as a gift and showed how happy he made that child. So all these positive stories rather than the challenges can be shared within the school context. Something that I see some schools do, which is really good, is to invite parents of school graduates who had autism, who had a very positive school experience, and to have those parents speak to both the students as well as the staff about that positive school experience that that family had and that that student had. Finally, and this is very important if we are going to embrace the need for us to change our school systems, for us to change our school communities, and for each one of us to change our own behavior. And that is the myth that autism is something that's within the child, what I refer to as the disease model of autism. Well, first of all, we know that autism is not a disease, so if you ever hear anybody use that term, that's actually an accurate term. Certainly there are many challenges, as we all know, that many students with autism experience, but it's not one thing that can be pointed to with a particular gene causing it or a particular type of developmental anomaly causing that. Progress certainly has to do with a person moving along developmentally, but we cannot define progress solely in terms of changing the behavior of the student with autism. We have to understand that there are some people within the culture of autism that are striving for kids to be normal. But as somebody once said, normal is nothing more than a setting on a dryer. What is normal? And many of you have heard that cliche. The consequences of autism is only within the child is that we set goals to change students, but we do not set goals for staff and school communities, or at least we do not hold them up at the same level of importance as changing the behavior of the student. So we really need to reflect on and change what we do, everything from interpersonal supports provided on a one-to-one level to how a child with autism is supported within the context of a classroom, within an assembly in the school environment, and out on recess, and in general within the school community. So another negative consequence is if a student doesn't make progress, very often we say, well, he just can't attend, or he's just not interested in doing this. Comments such as that imply that it's the student's fault, or in some cases, it's the parent's fault. They just don't follow through. We have to understand in many cases, students with autism do not do well because we're not providing the appropriate supports. It's not that the burden should be on the students who have autism. It shouldn't be that it's their fault or the family's fault. And in some cases, people will say, oh, he's just so impaired that there's little potential for growth. Well, almost on a daily basis, there are stories of students with autism be so impaired that parents were told, don't expect any progress, expect that your child would need full-time care for the rest of his life. And more we're hearing stories of parents who've heard those prognostications who now talk about their teenage son or daughter who's become significantly more, and in some cases totally independent, who have demonstrated knowledge and abilities and communication skills that nobody thought they could achieve. One of the most common comments that I hear from parents is, well, you know, Jimmy proved them wrong again. So we do need to understand that the potential for progress is limitless, and we cannot prognosticate about where a child will be based upon a particular snapshot that we see at a point in time. And we have to embrace the fact that a child's progress to a great extent depends upon the supports that we provide, not just some kind of predetermined potential within the child. It's very important that we embrace the notion that autism is a shared human experience. It becomes part of the fabric of life for all involved, educators, families, and those with autism, and not even for educators and related service professionals. So we can go through the steps that we've mentioned in understanding autism as a shared human experience. We could think about, and again, I think it's a very helpful exercise for staff to do this in school. Reflect on how autism is influencing your life and the students you work with. How are they influencing your life? What about some of the challenges, but also the positive influences that it's had on you as a person, that it's had on you as a developing human being? In terms of compassion, when we feel challenged or frustrated, we could say, wow, if I feel this way, imagine how parents or family members may feel in similar situations. The notion of appreciation. When we talk about how we feel when a student is succeeding or is making unexpected progress, again, it's not just progress within the child. It makes us feel competent. It makes us feel like we're giving back as people to other people. And it should be a celebration for all of us, not just saying, okay, well, he's increased so many points on this IQ test, or his grades have improved to this level. We should also embrace what we're doing and celebrate that as well. So important for morale and so important for preventing burnout, especially for those of us who have a lot of factors that lead to burnout in our work experiences. And in terms of support, let me quote a woman with autism who I mentioned earlier, Roz Blackburn: have high expectations for people with autism with appropriate and, when necessary, high levels of support. Roz was considered to be a severely behaviorally disordered young child with autism up until about 10 or 12 years of age. She now lectures internationally and is one of the most sought-after people with autism on the lecture circuit. I've had the great privilege of presenting workshops with her and of speaking with her. What actions can schools take to really help us understand the shared experience? We need to shift our focus on our behavior and our attitudes, not just on the student and how the student is doing. We have to understand the positive impacts that a student with autism has on the community in general and on other students. Many of you could think about a student with autism in your school who has other students who are drawn to him or her. And those may be the students who become the future special educators, the future educators, the future speech and language pathologists. I see that every time I go out for a consultation. A teacher or a therapist will always tell me who are the students who are drawn to this particular student with autism. And what I hope to see is how that can be used in a productive way. So we need to accept the obligation for changes on our part, not just changing the students or the parents. And we need to communicate on the whole community level that the student with autism and all of our students are valued members of the school community. They're not an afterthought. They're not in a classroom in a different wing of the building where they have no contact or minimal contact with other students. They are in the mainstream of activities and equally valued as members of the school community. Getting back to this notion of uniquely human, why does this perspective help us? As I mentioned earlier, if we could look at autism as an experience of an individual who has neurological differences, who learns in different ways, might have specific strengths and not just challenges, that deeper understanding of autism not only helps to build trust with the students and their families, but it makes our communities more humane and caring with that recognition that we are a very diverse community, and ultimately it makes us all better people. And in my book, Uniquely Human, which will be out in just a couple of months, I share dozens of stories on many of the points that we've just discussed, many stories that you would be able to relate to that will really bring to light that a uniquely human perspective leads us in many, many more productive ways, not only to support our students, but to support our communities as well. I hope this discussion has addressed some important issues that you face in providing effective services for students with autism and their families. And now we have a few minutes for questions.
Thanks, Barry. That was fantastic. I always learn so much when you talk, so I think the whole crowd is appreciative here. And what a positive note to end on, by the way. We can't wait to read your new book. For those of you who are interested in the resources that Barry has recommended, you can visit his website at barrypresent.com or learn more about CERTS at certs.com. That's SCERTS.com. You can also follow Barry on Twitter and Facebook. All right, so time for questions. Barry, there are hundreds of questions here for you. It's no surprise. You've sparked a lot of interest among our listeners. So let's just start out with the first one, which I think will cover a lot of ground. how is your uniquely human approach different from ABA therapy?
Yes. Let me begin by saying that, first of all, ABA therapy is not just one thing, and those practitioners who are trained in ABA know that there are many different versions and subcategories under ABA. And let me clarify also that uniquely human isn't so much a therapy approach with designated techniques to follow. We do that more in our CERTS model in terms of an assessment and intervention paradigm. So some of the differences that I would really highlight have to do with differences with what's, and we refer to as traditional ABA. And a lot of traditional ABA approaches and some even contemporary ABA approaches have the measurement of progress being primarily in reducing or eliminating behaviors that have been referred to as autistic behaviors, as I discussed earlier. Of course, the focus is often on building positive skills. I don't want to leave that out of the equation. Let me just share something with you very briefly. Just a few days ago, I had the wonderful opportunity to share a keynote address at a conference of the National Association of State Directors of Developmental Disability Services. And I shared it with a wonderful woman named Julia Bascom, who has autism, and she's the Deputy Executive Director of the Autism Self-Advocacy Network. And we were having a discussion about the evolution of applied behavior analytic approaches and talking about so many of the positive changes that have happened over the years. And she said this to me, you know, the problem that I have as a self-advocate and that my association still has is that the goal is to make people with autism look and behave normal. And the uniquely human approach really does understand that there may be behavioral patterns that people with autism engage in that look different, that look unconventional, but might actually be helpful to them. So that we just can't categorize behaviors on the surface as desirable or undesirable, that if a student rocks in certain activities, it might be his way of self-calming. Or if a student needs to pace or move, that should be built into the program. So that's one of the big differences, that we don't start with just categorizing behaviors as desirable or undesirable, but we start with really asking what I refer to as the deep question of why. From a person's perspective, why they might be doing this, and how can we change environments and our practices. So that's another big point that I see as different, and that is we have to really look at how we change our behavior in terms of interpersonal supports and learning supports. And it goes a lot more than just the ABA practice, the very common ABA practice of setting up reinforcement schedules and how faithful are we in following that reinforcement schedule. So in a uniquely human approach, we feel that we need to be much, much more flexible by constantly reading a student's emotional regulatory status and really getting to know that student developmentally, which is another big difference that I would want to emphasize. A uniquely human approach is steeped very deeply in research on child and human development and differences that we see in people with autism and learning differences. And we want to understand and in many cases honor those learning differences. And the last point I'll make is that we really look at a focus on self-determination, and that is giving as much control, and sometimes control within structure, but as much control as possible to a person with autism. I have always found it interesting that some practices that are a little bit more teacher-directed very often make decisions for kids with autism when they're very young. And again, we measure progress based upon how much the child's behavior kind of conforms to our notion of progress. But that when these individuals reach the teenage years, then there's this great focus on self-determination and choice and so forth. But unfortunately, in many cases, we've taught kids to be passive. We've taught kids to respond primarily when they're prompted to respond. So I don't want to overly generalize about ABA because it is such a wide range of practices, but in general, these are the differences that I see, and certainly the differences that many people with autism see, and especially those who are self-advocates.
So some people, as you know, think that ABA is the only way to work with children with ASD. What's your advice for those who really think there's only one way, or who may not be open to alternate methods?
Okay. Well, let me, again, put right up front. Applied behavior analysis has made many contributions to emerging practices and current practices in autism that have been extremely positive in many ways. But when we hear ABA is the only way, which we still do hear from some practitioners, from some agencies that even cited on their websites, it is not factually correct. Major reviews of interventions in autism have indicated now for a number of years that based upon the current level and methodology and research, we cannot make that statement. In addition to that, it is true that other approaches, some of them fall into the category of developmental approaches, relationship-based approaches. We're not there at the beginning doing good research to demonstrate the efficacy of those approaches, but that has changed. And now there is efficacy data that's available on relationship-based approaches as well. So I think, quite honestly, it's very important for practitioners to be aware of many practices and to receive training in many practices. And actually, with our particular framework, the CERTS model, we say one of the predictors of a good practitioner in the CERTS model is a person who's been trained in many different approaches, including contemporary ABA approaches. So that statement that ABA is the only way, the only form of intervention that works with kids and people with autism is factually incorrect at this point in time. And if anybody looks at reviews of the research, you will see that is the case.
Yeah, Barry, I think one of the reasons we have got that question is because ABA is so entrenched in reimbursement mechanisms and policies. What do you see as the path forward for CERTS and other methodologies that have a lot of evidence to receive at least equal treatment and reimbursement and economically, and some of these things that involve dollars and cents but unfortunately drive a lot of behavior?
Yes, yeah, that's a great question, and I can answer that very specifically. Largely due to our interaction with the leaders of the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network. Ari Niemann is the founder and director. I mentioned Julia, and I just had the opportunity less than a week ago to spend quite a bit of time with Julia over dinner and chatting with her. And one of their major missions is to bring some of the more recent research forward to policymakers and to agencies that create the policies, demonstrating that, yes, applied behavior analysis is an evidence-based practice, but there are other evidence-based practices as well. And I actually published a 3-part article on this a few years ago with one of the sections being called as ABA the Only Way. And I couched that in terms of treatment options and parent choice. And if we are truly family-centered in our practice, we should not be saying to parents, this is the only approach that you should be following, or especially with the research base now, that this is the only approach that works. That different approaches have different kinds of goals and have a different culture surrounding that approach, if you will. So if, for example, in applied behavior analysis, has been traditionally more of a focus on teaching kind of school readiness skills, cognitive skills, and so forth. Whereas in other approaches, there's been much more of a focus on developing relationships with other children and developing social skills. Now there are hybrid approaches. As a matter of fact, there's a new category called naturalistic behavioral developmental intervention approaches, which focuses on skill building as well as relationships, peer relationships in schools, inclusion, and so forth. So there's been a nice hybrid that has developed. I find it interesting that in a recent article on the NBDI approaches that I just mentioned, the authors included CERTS in that model as kind of an ABA-based approach, which it really isn't. It's a developmentally based approach. But this coming together is very, very positive. On the policy level, getting back to your question, I think the policymakers really need to be educated more about the current palette of approaches that's out there for individuals with autism. And I'll also make one other comment about that. If you look at contemporary ABA practices, they have become more contemporary because leaders in contemporary applied behavior analysis, such as the Kegels at Santa Barbara, such as Gail McGee at Emory, have pulled a great deal from the developmental literature and the child-centered and the family-centered literature. So I believe when people just hear the ABA, they think of it as being one thing, and these hybrid approaches have really helped to bridge the gap. And so we do look at that very seriously as now our need to educate policymakers and not go on old information that has been repeated over and over again, that there's only one approach that's evidence-based, and that's applied behavior analysis.
So let's go from the policy level to something more in the trenches. What is your advice for handling physical aggression towards the special education team from children with autism?
Well, I always begin with, well, what do you really mean by that word? So in this case, let's define aggression. And I have found that very often in my consulting, a student will be called aggressive, and when I actually observe an instance that meets the definition of aggression, and it might be striking out against another person, causing physical harm, whatever, that there are other triggers. Aggression is not something that lives within the child. So it might be, and I just mentioned this in my webinar talk, it might be that the child is touched unexpectedly and the child almost reflexively strikes out if they're very tactily defensive. So getting back to the notion, if a child does engage in behavior that may be harmful to others, and we define aggression very narrowly in terms of the child is intending to hurt others rather than simply engages in behavior that may result in harm to others. We have to look at the purposes or the functions, and any person right now trained in autism should know we have to look at the purposes or functions of behavior. A lot of what is defined as aggressive behavior falls into the categories of protest behavior or refusal behaviors. We do know that offering choices whenever possible is one way to reduce challenging behavior, including aggressive behavior. Because if we try to impose decisions on kids, you have to eat this food, or you have to get online right now, or you have to stand in this place online, you're much likely to get pushback, which might be aggressive or resistant behavior. From a uniquely human perspective also, we have to say, what is our role? Why do we see such patterns of behavior only with certain people or only in certain environments? Why do we see it when a child is not using a visual schedule, but we don't see it, or we see it much less when a child is prepared for transitions? So I think prevention, of course, is the way we absolutely want to go. Now, for those students who do demonstrate physical aggression, even after the fact of a lot of supports, preventative supports put into place, of course, staff need to be trained on how not to throw gasoline on the fire, on a hands-off approach as much as possible, keeping other people, other students safe, as well as the individual, who unfortunately is at that level of emotional arousal that they react in a way that's considered to be aggressive. And then finally, and I actually discussed this in an earlier webinar for Presence Learning, we have to, the webinar on preventing problem behavior, we have to look at variables that may lead to what is defined as aggressive behavior: biological, psychological, social variables. So I'll just give you one quick example of each. Biological, the child might be in pain. The child might have severe gastrointestinal issues and is striking out because he or she is so physiologically dysregulated. Psychological variables: is this child's life predictable? Or do they drop to the floor if they're not sure what's happening, and when somebody tries to take them by the hand and pick them up, then the child tries to scratch or bite at that point. Social variables: is the child in an environment that's so overwhelming on a social basis that he or she needs to fight to survive? I gave that example in the webinar. As a matter of fact, Roz Blackburn talks about that. She was considered aggressive when she was young, but she said, if I was in a noisy, busy room and I need to leave that room and you try to stop me, I don't see you as a person. You could be a 6-foot chunk of wood, and I will knock you over to get out of that room because I am in my fight or flight mode. And that's another thing that I don't think is really honored enough, that due to the neurological challenges in autism, many people with autism are much likely to reach that fight or flight neurological survival level, and we still see it as behavior that's under the child's control or the person's control.
So let's talk about this from the classroom teacher's perspective.
Yes.
What are the skills that they can develop or work on to help include children with autism in the mainstream?
Yes, that's a great question as well. I think, first of all, and let me start on the attitudinal level, because some teachers really see that as an important part of their role, that every child in the classroom is fully engaged with the right supports, that every child has the same opportunities, each child has the same opportunities as the next child, regardless of their developmental challenges. So I think attitude is the right starting point. And let me say, in the great majority of cases, when a teacher acts as if he or she would rather not have that student with autism in the classroom, in the great majority of cases, it's not that that person's a bad person. It's that they don't feel supported and the right supports aren't in place for him or for her in that instance. So I think that's very important. So deal with some more specifics. Utilizing strengths. That is a very, very significant issue. And acknowledging what a student likes to do. And it's easier sometimes with students a little bit further down the path in their school career, where it becomes more clear what their strengths are and what their interests are. But I don't want to say it's magical all the time, but I've seen some pretty great turnarounds in terms of success of a child in a classroom where their strengths and interests was infused into academics, was infused in activities, social activities with other kids. So I think that that's a very important piece. Certainly understanding the learning style of students with autism, which is fairly comprehensive knowledge in the field right now. It wasn't a couple of decades ago that most individuals with autism, not all, but most individuals benefit greatly from multimodal teaching, from visual instruction and visual cues and supports. All of that feeds into a student who has such a different learning style that they could benefit from different input modalities that they have. I think it's also important that a teacher understand emotional regulation, and that is what keeps a child most available for learning and engaging. Does a child need breaks, systematic breaks throughout the day, even more so than a typically developing child, even though research is now indicating that exercise and movement helps all students learn. It's not just for students who have special needs. And I think the last point I'll make, I could make many more, but the last point I'll make is being a good team leader, because I never think of a classroom teacher or an SLP or an OT or a school psychologist as individual people, you know, on an island unto themselves. So if there are support people in the classroom for a student with autism or other students, does the teacher have those skills to know when to seek support from somebody else in the classroom, to still lead the lesson, and in some cases use those subtle nonverbal cues that indicate, oh, this child with autism is getting a little antsy now, maybe he or she needs a break right now. So being kind of literally at the head of the class and knowing the students well enough that the team can function as a smoothly flowing team throughout the course of the school year.
So Barry, we only have a few more minutes here. We'd love to try and get in another question or two. So someone is asking, how can we best support students with ASD as they transition to work and college, knowing that society will expect them to conform to social norms?
Yeah, you know, this is one of the topics that is at the forefront of concern right now, as it's become a cliche as well that all of those younger students and those cute kids with autism are now becoming adults, and they are leaving the school support system. And of course, there's a lot more money, there needs to be more, but there's more money being put into research on this topic now, and there's more consideration of transition programs. So I think in terms of the latter part of your question, knowing that society will expect them to conform to social norms, I think that we're working on that all along, but we have to be developmentally appropriate. And we have to, and I'm saying this in a positive way, we have to pick our battles. Sometimes we focus on rather inconsequential patterns of behavior that we want to change in people with autism, just so other people maybe do not look at them and say, oh, why is he doing that? Whereas there may be many, many other patterns of behavior, such as knowing how to engage socially, knowing how to greet others, that make them more desirable partners. So when they go into a workplace, they could make friends, and they're not seen as somebody who is not a worthy friend or a worthy partner. Certainly, a big issue right now is matching the strengths and the learning style of people with autism to potential work opportunities. That we know that there are certain skills that certain people with autism might have that fit very, very well into the requirements of different work opportunities, whether it be in science fields. There are wonderful, innovative programs, most of them very small at this point, looking for mentoring arrangements, for example, for certain people with autism in the film industry or in the computer industry. And even for those individuals who are much more challenged in their behavior, still matching what they might be able to do in different kinds of work settings, giving them internship experiences. There's a lot of interest in mentorships. So rather than having a person or adult, it could be a teenager or adult with autism, going into a setting where they're getting general training, making sure they develop a relationship with somebody they could trust. So that person is a trustworthy person who can help the person with autism develop those skills in those particular settings. So just a quick example. There are some individuals with autism who are non-speaking individuals. They might use non-speech systems, speech-generating devices, who work in stores such as CVS pharmacies, where they're very good at matching. So they might be able to stock the shelves. And as one person told me who worked in a drugstore, a young man with autism kept the shelves neater than they had ever seen in that pharmacy before. So I think and I'm quoting Stephen Shore now, a man with autism who also has a doctorate in special education. Stephen talks a great deal about matching the developmental profile and the learning strengths of a person with autism to a possible job setting or vocation. And that's not enough. Let me just tell you something from my personal experience. A young man who I actually diagnosed when he was 3, and he's in his mid-20s now. And he had the skills and really enjoyed working in bakeries. And he actually decorated cakes. He was very good at making pictures on children's birthday cakes. But what was found was that if there was a very tense, stressful environment in a particular bakery, because he worked in different bakeries, that would not work. He felt the tension, he felt the anxiety from the other staff, and even though he liked the work, the environment was not conducive to his staying well-regulated emotionally, and eventually he was able to go to a different setting where there was kind of a calmer environment, but he was still using the same skills he had in an environment that really worked for him.
Thank you, Barry. I started off by saying we learned so much from the presentation, but I think I learned almost an equal amount from the questions. There's just so much in there to talk about. And I think our listeners clearly feel the same way, because we are still getting lots of questions submitted. So we will have to take this to Twitter and Facebook and our blog to continue the discussion. Thank you to our listeners, and again to Barry. Right now, Presence Learning is growing rapidly. We're serving thousands of students across the country and internationally every single day. Every single day, I also hear amazing success stories about the work of our clinicians and the impact they have on our students' lives. If you or someone you know is interested in working from home on their own schedule and making a huge difference in children's lives, please refer them to our website to learn more about working online with Presence Learning. We are currently offering work for speech therapists, occupational therapists, counselors, psychologists, social workers, and special education teachers. After this webinar ends, you'll be getting an email with your certificate of attendance and links to the recording of today's program. I encourage you to share the link and recommend this program to your colleagues. For SLPs who are requesting ASHA CEUs for this webinar, we will submit your attendance information to ASHA immediately. Please be patient, as it may take as long as 6 weeks for ASHA to update your records. Finally, here's some exciting news. You'll want to make plans and tell your colleagues about our upcoming summer Greatest Hits professional development offering, all available for ASHA CE credits. We've pulled together several of our sped ahead webinars that attracted huge audiences and received raved reviews, including our 2 all-time biggest draws, Temple Grandin and Marty Burns. You can watch one or all of these at your convenience and earn ASHA CE credit for each and every one of them. As you can see on your screen, this is an all-star cast in a range of topics that will provide you with all kinds of great information and new ways to address many of the challenges you'll face when school reopens in the fall. You can start earning credit on July 15th at plearn.co/greatest-hits-2015. And finally, thank you from everyone at Presence Learning. We are committed to unlocking the potential of every child through online therapy. Your feedback on these webinars is important to us. At the conclusion of this program in a moment, you'll be directed to a feedback survey for the webinar. Please let us know what you thought. For more info or a live demo of how our online therapy services work, email us at schools@presencelearning.com. Thanks again for your participation, and have a great day.